been trying to work. It was just about the passcode. We set it up the normal way, but for some reason it didn't do the normal thing. So apologies. I hope you've all managed to get a cup of tea or coffee or whatever in the meantime. So first of all, Parenting Across Scotland is a partnership of 9 organisations of different family types, looking at parenting, looking at parents and what they need in Scotland. So we work giving information to parents, we work transmitting the messages of the organisations we work with, who work with tens of thousands of parents throughout Scotland, and talk to government and others about what parents need and want. So today, we're going to be looking at the UNCRC and how it supports families. I think that very often people seem to think that children's rights and parents' rights are 2 separate things, and that perhaps there's even a tension or a conflict between them. And we think that actually nothing could be further from the truth. Everybody has human rights, and what children's rights are children's human rights, and they're very much about parents and the family. And that's because the UNCRC mentions the word parents more times than it mentions the word children. It puts families right at the heart and centre of the UNCRC. This bit is from the Preamble, and it says, recognising that the child, for the full and harmonious development of his or her personality, should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love and understanding. That's what underpins the UNCRC, and many of the articles are about how the family should be supported to support the child. It goes on to say that the family is a fundamental group in society. It's actually the natural place where children should be brought up. And for the growth and well-being of all its members, and especially children, it should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance so it can fully assume its responsibilities within the community. It goes on to say that the state should afford families that kind of protection. And it mentions a load of things, from poverty to housing, to play, even to digital. I suppose what we're particularly looking at today is that kind of background, that kind of infrastructure that we need for families not just to survive, but to thrive. Because we know that for many at the minute, poverty means, even pre-pandemic, 1 in 4 children were living in poverty, and that is rising. So we know that we need the kind of infrastructure so that families can thrive. We need that kind of background of sufficient income, work where possible, housing and support, so that families can bring up their children in the best way possible. And we know that currently that's just not happening for a number of reasons. Like everything else, the UNCRC is not a magic bullet. It provides a framework. The UNCRC bill has gone through Parliament, and as many of you will know, what has now happened, it's stalled due to a challenge from the UK government, and we're waiting for it to go back to Parliament. Once it does pass, it will put duties on local authorities and others to consider the UNCRC in everything it does. And that will include housing strategies, obviously children's plans, any kind of strategy. So, I mean, transport, planning, they will need to take into consideration children and families and how they're supported. And I suppose we then go on to think about, well, how does that fit with other things that are going on in Scotland at the minute? And looking at the Promise and family support. The Promise has come up with its recommendations, which have been accepted by government. We're looking at how we implement them and how that family support offer and the prevention of families having children taken into care is actually implemented. We need the basic first. We need to make sure that everybody has enough to live on. Sorry, I've managed to lose my slide. I'll just switch them off actually. Oh, stop sharing, sorry. And I suppose I was going to go on. We've got 3 great speakers today that are experts in their own fields on poverty, on housing, and on family support. We've got Satwat Rehman, who is Director of One Parent Family Scotland. We have got Alison Watson, who is Director of Shelter, and SallyAnn Kelly, who is CEO of Aberlour. So I'm going to introduce Satwat in a minute, and I just wanted to sort of remember, and Satwat and myself, given evidence to some of you will remember the UN rapporteur on poverty, who identified child poverty in the UK as a major issue. And while we were given evidence, I was speaking and I was saying that, you know, in terms of fighting poverty, actually implementing the UNCRC was really crucial because it provided that framework and that background. And I was saying this to him and he had a kind of wry smile on his face. And I really thought that I wasn't convincing him of what I was saying, and I kept on speaking and telling him we really needed the UNCRC because actually it was all about families and it was very supportive of families. And when I stopped, Philip Alston just turned to me and said, actually, you know, you're right, that's what it's all about. I wrote it. So I was telling the man who wrote major parts of the UNCRC that actually we should implement it and incorporate. So I'll move on to Satwat, and thanks all for bearing with us. It's been a bit strange starting so late and trying to fiddle around behind the scenes.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm really sorry we're not in the same room together and seeing each other, because I always feel that in some ways when we're talking about something like this, helps us spark ideas off each other, but hopefully not too long now before we can do that. And thank you, Claire, for that introduction and the preamble to the UNCRC. I am going to be focusing on families. I'm going to be focusing on parents, particularly single parent families, when looking at some of this. And that's because when children don't just walk in, what they do is they bring their families and their lives and their experiences with them. So when we're looking at how we make real these rights for children and young people, there's a context there, there's a community there, there are tensions there, and we need to be exploring all those through this. In terms of poverty, many human rights conventions make clear that poverty is a human rights issue, and living in poverty is a denial of those rights. Claire spoke about Philip Alston, the UN rapporteur, and he'd identified child poverty as a major rights infringement here in the UK. And Article 27 of the UNCRC places a duty on state parties to recognise the rights of every child to a standard of living that's adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development. And where this right is not met, children will be considered as living in poverty. And that should be the overarching principle on which we base our anti-poverty work. Historically, though, child poverty has not really been considered via a child rights lens. And similarly, when looking at children's rights, in the past, there was a failure to engage with child poverty as a rights issue. These two areas have become much more closely aligned, and I honestly believe the incorporation of the UNCRC into law in Scotland will cement that alignment. Because poverty is a breach of children and families' right to that adequate standard of living. It has far-reaching impacts on their rights to health, housing, food, education. Families living in poverty are more likely to experience insecurity, exclusion, powerlessness as a result of the denial of their justice, equality, dignity, and personal freedom. So really fundamental issues here that we're dealing with. So why does all this matter to us? The situation we have in the UK and in Scotland is one of increasing poverty levels, persistent and deeper poverty for many families. And the trends currently are going in the wrong direction to what we would like. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation Poverty 2022 report that was published a couple of days ago identifies these as key issues, that poverty is continuing to rise. Across the UK, we're looking at almost 1 in 3 children living in poverty. It's 1 in 4 here in Scotland. And for us, nearly half of the children in single parent families live in poverty, compared with 1 in 4 of those in couple families. Of the working age adults, single parents are by far the most likely of any family type to be struggling with poverty. So the risk of poverty doesn't fall equally, and we need to look at this also from a rights perspective. So as well as Article 27, there's Article 26, the right to benefit from social security. And this is a critical right in terms of tackling poverty, as in the short term, this will make a difference. This is what will make the difference if we want to reduce and end poverty. A non-punitive social security system that supports and keeps families out of poverty. Article 27, we've spoken about the adequate standard of living, and that includes a whole range of things. And I'm sure Alison will be focusing in on housing, so I'm not going to look at housing and housing costs, which are obviously fundamental to tackling child poverty. Articles 28 and 29 look at the right to education and development. Critical in terms of how accessible, supportive, appropriate is what we're providing for children and young people. Article 24 is the right to the best health possible, which includes the right to adequate and nutritious food, which, as we know, affects many children in poverty when they experience food insecurity. And then we have Article 31, the right to rest, leisure, play, and participation in cultural and artistic life. Again, how do we facilitate that access for those on the lowest incomes? Now, as Claire said, the UNCRC acknowledges the vital role of parents and families to children and considers the fact that children's rights are best met in the family environment, which guarantees their care and protection. So how we support families is critical to the realisation of the rights in the UNCRC. And it's integral to Scotland keeping the promise for care experienced children and young people, where the risks of poverty are greater as a result of systemic failings, denying children and young people their rights as set out in the UNCRC. Now, what do we have here in Scotland that can support us with this? In Scotland, we have a Child Poverty Act with statutory targets to end child poverty by 2030, with a focus on priority family groups, including single parents. So we have single parents as a priority family group, ethnic minority families, families where somebody is disabled or has a long-term limiting condition. We have young parents, larger families, and families with children under 1. These are the ones where the risk of poverty is seen as being greater. And actually, what we also see is that often families will fall in more than one of those priority groups. We have a child poverty delivery plan, which focuses on the drivers that can help reduce child poverty. And these are increasing income from employment, and that would be parental employment, and also how we look to support young people into good quality pay, well-paid work. So it's fair work, living wage, living hours, progression in work, and family-friendly, flexible working. Second driver is increasing income from social security. And here I think one of the things that could undermine the rights of children is some of the interactions that we have between the UK and the Scottish benefits. The punitive system we have in place with conditionality and sanctions, of universal credit, but we have opportunities and the new Scottish benefits that are coming online, and also particularly the Scottish Child Payment. The third driver is reducing household costs. And that again would be key to underpinning the realisation of some of the rights I've spoken about in terms of ensuring that cost is not a barrier to play, to leisure, to cultural activities, to full participation in many arenas of life. So what we have is an alignment in a way with some of the articles in the UNCRC, especially 27 and 26, and what we've got as drivers and targets in the Child Poverty Act. So we have a framework which can underpin the actions we need to take to end child poverty, and a rights-based convention which will be enshrined in law. And that should be our starting point to review and see how we are doing and what more can we do. So if we look at single parent families as an example, children in single parent families in Scotland are more likely to live in poverty and for longer than couple families. The proportion of children in single parent families living in poverty has been increasing in recent years. And most children in poverty in single parent families live with a parent who is not in work. And that's why I was talking about reducing household costs and social security being critical to look to see how we support families out of poverty. And there's a whole range of other issues that come on from that in terms of transport, qualifications, education, employment, health problems. So these are all the things that we need to be looking at through the lens of the UNCRC. And we need to be looking at why single parent families are more likely to be in poverty, so we can ensure that we're addressing the root causes. They're predominantly single mothers with dependent children, which means there's just one potential earner in the family. Hourly earnings are likely to be lower because of the gender pay gap, and the parent is limited in the hours they can work by caring responsibilities. So there's a number of factors which interact to trap families in poverty. Personal circumstances, like I've spoken about in terms of caring responsibilities, the UK social security system, the punitive measures, the conditionality, how it bars parents from accessing further and higher education, employability. Support into employment provision in Scotland currently needs to be improved to be fit for purpose for the families that we're working with. The way the labour market is structured, childcare and access to social care, all these things impact on poverty and the experiences of the families we work with. And these issues matter for children's rights as they limit the capacity of parents and families to support their children and to realise those rights. And they also create the conditions that keep children in poverty. So it's critical to look to see how we can apply the UNCRC, as Claire said, across a range of policy areas which might not naturally have been seen as being the home of this type of work. So if we want to take a preventative, rights-based approach to child poverty by looking at causes, impacts, drivers, targets as set out in the Scottish Government Delivery Plan, income is at the heart of the matter. So child poverty measures to address child poverty need to be mitigated, and long-term prevention, looking at how we realise these rights, needs to be at the heart of what we do. How do we support families with a decent minimum income guarantee? How do we reduce living costs through, for example, universal basic services, in order to make these rights for children and young people and families real and meaningful rights? Because I think I also remember the special rapporteur speaking about how important it is to ensure that there are the mechanisms for the implementation and the realization of the rights, to make the framework real for families and not have it as something where we have the intent is there, but actually the follow through isn't. So it's really important to look to see what are the measures we can all be taking in our work, in our lives, to make this real. And SallyAnn's going to talk about family support, but I think in recognising the importance of whole family support, we should be looking at the 10 principles of family support in the promise, because ultimately they would allow us to take that rights-based approach with the articles in the UNCRC as a starting point. One other thing I just want to say when we're looking at how we support families and children is that not all families in poverty will face the same challenges. What we do must be responsive to the different needs of the families, and they're not a homogenous group. And inequalities intersect, and that's why it's really important to take that look, that holistic look. For example, the majority of single parents are women. However, there are other multiple factors. Not all single mothers share the same level of disadvantage purely because they're women. Single mothers we work with from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities will speak about their experiences of racial discrimination and racism. Those who we work with who have a disability will talk about the issues that they have trying to access services and ensure that the right support is there for them to be able to take on training or work. So using the UNCRC as a fundamental basis, we need to capture the diversity of the families. So what we're developing is inclusive of the experiences of families facing multiple inequalities and poverty. So again, a rights-based approach would guard against homogenizing experience and need, ensuring that we're going to provide services and support that address the issues, experiences, and causes of poverty, which may differ across communities. For example, we've got a campaign at the moment on the young parent penalty, where the amount of universal credit you will get as a young parent differs from what you would get as somebody who's older, over 25. And that's based on the premise that young people may not need as much because they're possibly living at home, don't have the same outgoings. That's not the case for young parents. So what we're seeing is a structural inequality being built into the system. And it's about taking a rights-based approach to look to see how we can tackle some of those. And that's where I'm hoping in time, when we have the UNCRC incorporated into law in Scotland, we can look to see what access there might be for recourse in law. And there have already been some relevant cases on child poverty, both considering the courts, domestic and international. And in 2015, the UK Supreme Court considered whether the benefit cap, which caps the amount of money on benefits that a family will get, irrespective of the size of the family or the needs of the family, breached Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights and Article 3 of the UNCRC. Now, while a minority of the court found the cap would deprive children of their basic needs, which would not be in their best interests, the majority held the cap could be justified. Therefore, it was lawful. The court concluded that the UNCRC had no role in the case as it's not incorporated into law at UK level. But again, this raises interesting questions about the prospect of UNCRC incorporation in Scotland and whether that would allow us an in to use it as a measure to challenge breaches of children's rights as a result of child poverty. That's just one example. There are others, and we can share those later. But just to end, I want to say that actually the UNCRC provides us with a family focus, with a child at the heart. It provides us for a focus through the articles that I've spoken about and anti-poverty work, and enhances and acts as a foundation of other rights: education, housing, health, cultural life, leisure, play, etc. So through a rights-based approach, we have the scaffolding and we have the framework. We can align those rights to the drivers to tackle child poverty. Also through the UNCRC, there is a focus on participation and the voices of children and young people being at the heart, aligns very well with the work we're doing in the Promise here in Scotland. Also what many of us who are doing anti-poverty work speak about. We need to be led by those with direct experience of how it is now. We can look to see how in the short term there are measures we can take through social security to realise those rights and look at mitigation and family income. And in the longer term, how we can ensure access to education, health, housing, leisure activities, all support children and young people living in poverty with better outcomes and reduce the risk of poverty for them. So it allows for the immediate action, for example, the Scottish Child Payment. Also look to see that there are no financial barriers to learning, ELC, early learning and childcare, health. Look to how we address the impact of poverty on educational outcomes and actions to ensure that poverty is not inevitable for future generations. It's a choice, it's something we can do a lot about to address. And the UNCRC also should enable us to ensure coherence across the actions to tackle child poverty and the transformation we need in how we support children, young people and families and provide that holistic support as set out by the Promise Scotland. Every step of the way, we need to ensure the centrality of the voices of children and young people and families, and that we provide the means for children and young people to enjoy the rights that are theirs in law and go beyond them. So we're not holding ourselves to the minimum that's provided by the UNCRC, but the best we can do. So we have a fundamental and valuable framework in the UNCRC, which gives us the floor below which no child should fall. And we should look at how in our aspirations and sights for the future, we can be more ambitious ambitious and how we hold ourselves to account based on what we've done to remove the risk and threat of poverty for all children and young people in Scotland, especially those at the greatest risk of poverty, the priority families in the Child Poverty Act, and care experienced children and young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Satwat. First of all, we've got a short amount of time for questions, and before we go on to the next speaker, is that we'll have a panel afterwards where people can ask questions and we can go into discussions. But if anyone would like to ask a brief question now, perhaps you could post it in the chat. And I should have said before, anyone just post questions in the chat and we'll come on to them later. And I'm not seeing hands or questions, so we will go on to the next speaker. And I think that what Satwat said about the kind of basis of experience of poverty and kind of how complicated it can be and how many factors come into play is really important, because I think that one of the things that we really don't look at enough in terms of children and families is housing. And it tends to be seen as a separate issue in some way, which is absolutely ludicrous, given that families live in houses. And actually, if they don't have one, or if they don't have secure housing, it makes everything so much more difficult. Things are more expensive if you live in insecure housing, not knowing if you're going to be able to place your child in school, not knowing if it's going to be the same school where you're going to live. And at the minute in Scotland, we have a private rented sector that's growing, prices that are really, rents that are really hard to afford, many families having difficulties with housing. And I think housing is a human right, and it's also a right for children. But I'm sure Alison Watson from Shelter, who's the director, will have far more to say about that and knows far more about it than I do. So I'll hand over. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks very much for that kind and generous introduction, Claire. Very much appreciate that. And like Satwat, I'm really delighted to be part of this discussion today. It feels very timely. This is a very unique opportunity that we've got in Scotland to look at how we can drive real progressive change using human rights as a lens. We are running the risk of hitting more technical problems, but I'm delighted that the tech side has been taken out of my hands. I've got quite a reputation for messing that up, so thanks very much to Parenting Across Scotland to taking full control of my presentation. This is of real interest to Shelter Scotland also because we've always been interested in human rights as an organisation. We've always taken a rights-based approach to all of the advocacy that we do, whether that's advocacy that's with and for individuals and communities, but also in terms of the policy advocacy that we do that's about driving real and substantive systemic change in our housing system. So we were delighted after 3 years of campaigning around housing as a human right to see the Scottish Government enshrine that commitment in Housing 2040, a publication that came just before the general election in Scotland last year. And Housing 2040 really sets out the Scottish Government's key commitments on housing, both in terms of housing policy and housing supply. And I'll make some reference to that as I go through. So if we could just move on to the next slide. So housing is a human right. How does that break down? How do we understand how that's expressed in terms of UNCRC? So I've set out here just an outline of what I think are some of the key articles. I think what's really important to emphasise is that housing as a human right is not just about an adequate standard of living, it's also about the continuous improvement of living conditions. And it's also important to bear in mind that housing must meet several conditions in order for all of these rights to be satisfied. And I think in particular, it's about making sure that we don't take the definition of adequate housing to be narrow or restrictive. This is not just about shelter or a roof over your head. Rather, it has to be seen as the right to live somewhere in security, peace and dignity. I think the additional point I would make in relation to Article 27, this also makes clear that governments should assist parents and carers to ensure children are provided with an adequate standard of living. So there's quite an active component to the way that these duties would pertain to various public bodies. So if we move on to the next slide, what I want to try and do now is say, okay, how far do we have to travel in Scotland to really see housing as a human right and all of the standards that describe and underpin that really living and breathing for families across Scotland? What is the context in which we need to view the establishment of this right in ways that are about driving real and lasting change? The key issues I'm going to address are homelessness, evictions, affordability, and then housing conditions, also housing location. And what I'm going to be outlining is that in all of these areas, we really do have considerable ground to cover if we're going to make sure that these structural barriers don't prevent the realisation of housing as a human right. So I'll start with homelessness, if we could just move on to the next slide. What I've tried to do here is pick out some of the key formal statistics. Bluntly, far too many families in Scotland are experiencing homelessness. They're also experiencing long stays in unsuitable temporary accommodation. Now that's against the backdrop of Scotland actually having very progressive rights when it comes to housing, but there are gaps in legislation. For example, there's very few legal requirements on standards of temporary accommodation. We also know that many people are not being provided with the rights that they have in terms of housing legislation. So at Shelter Scotland, we hear of far too many occasions when people are presenting to their local authority as homeless and they're not being accepted as legally homeless. And also far too many cases where people are accepted as legally homeless, but are then not provided with the temporary accommodation that they have a legal entitlement to. I think a big caveat I would put on all of these statistics, which I think are a damning indictment of Scotland's housing emergency as they stand, but they are a significant underestimate. And I think that's particularly the case when it comes to families. We know that many families will choose what we call hidden homelessness, living in overcrowded situations, essentially camping out with family and friends, trying to avoid the need to present formally to their local authority as homeless. But even if you take the formal statistics, that these all come from what local authorities gather on a daily basis, this means that on average, 32 kids every single day in Scotland are becoming homeless. The other thing that really concerns Shelter Scotland about these statistics is what it tells us about the situation in temporary accommodation. Now, we've had 7 consecutive years where the number of people in temporary accommodation has continued to rise, and that includes consecutive years where we're seeing rising number of children in temporary accommodation. And I think the other thing I would pull out about temporary accommodation as it relates to the experiences of families in our homelessness system is that, as well as issues about conditions, which I'll come on to, we're also seeing real concerns about the increasing amounts of time that families are spending in temporary accommodation. On average, a family is spending 341 days in what is called temporary accommodation. Now, as I'm saying here on the slide, that means that if a family becomes homeless today, on the 20th of January, they won't get a permanent house until after Christmas this year. Now, I just don't think that's temporary accommodation. I don't think that is in any way in the spirit of the legislation that we've got in Scotland. And just to pick up the point about standards, in terms of trying to get an idea of where we're at with standards, a useful measure is looking at what's called the Unsuitable Accommodation Order. Now, this basically means that people should not be in unsuitable temporary accommodation for longer than 7 days. And by unsuitable in the main, we're talking about bed and breakfasts and hostels. Now, 2021, there were over 490 breaches of the Unsuitable Accommodation Order. So families in particular are being kept much longer than that 7 days in unsuitable accommodation. So a very challenging and very difficult backdrop as concerns homelessness. And if I can just move on to the next slide, what I want to draw out is those are the statistics, but every single one of those statistics is a family. And in those families, what impact is that having on children? Now, we know that homelessness has got long-term negative consequences on various aspects of a child's life, leaving some unable to realise many of their UNCRCR rights. We also know that the consequences worsen the longer a child is homeless. And we also know that children are still experiencing, in particular, the mental health issues that they pick up as in relation to homelessness at least a year after the family has been permanently resettled. So we're seeing some really significant impacts on mental and physical health for children. Now, Emma's story is very typical of what we see at Shelter Scotland. Emma was a single mum that we supported. She had children, she became homeless, and she also had depression. She was in temporary accommodation with her children, but she was really struggling to afford the rent due to the benefit cap. This was making her depression worse, and she was getting more and more worried about her housing situation. So she approached her council for help again. The housing officer said that she would have to give 2 of her children to her former partner or her mum so that she could no longer be subject to the benefit cap and could afford her housing. Now, that is a shameful and dreadful situation, and it's far too common in the experience of Shelter Scotland. We could move on to the next slide. I want to talk now about evictions. Now, Shelter Scotland believes that no household should be evicted into homelessness when they're being evicted from a social tenancy, that's a council tenancy or a housing association tenancy. But the reality is that evictions from social tenancies are still far too high in Scotland, particularly from local authorities. Now, for many of the households affected, this is leading to homelessness. So looking at the figures for 1920, 1,866 households were evicted and 43%, that's 805 households, were evicted into homelessness. Now, as well as all the traumatic effects of that eviction into homelessness for the families themselves, we conducted research last year which shows how costly these evictions are, both in terms of what that means for social landlords and indeed thus for the public purse. So those 1,866 evictions cost nearly £28 million. And that, I would have to say, in terms of the research that we did, is a significant underestimate. That means that each of those evictions is costing £24,000. Now, given the progressive nature of the duties in Scotland, where if you're homeless, you still have right to accommodation, this vicious cycle is costing the public purse an awful lot of money and not leading to anything other than trauma for the families involved. If we could move on to talk about affordability. Bluntly, high housing costs are a major driver in child poverty, and this was something that Satwat was talking about in her presentation, which I absolutely strongly agree with. We know that something like 50,000 kids are in child poverty in Scotland just because of high housing costs. The stark reality is that in far too many cases, housing is unaffordable for many families. And particularly private sector rents are increasing way above inflation. And I think given what we heard about the inflation rate this week, I think there's cause for even further concern. Now, if you look at the situation here in Edinburgh, where I live, that means that per month, the average rent in the private rented sector in Edinburgh is now over £1,300 per month. So we're seeing these huge increases in housing costs at a time when inflation is pushing up other household costs. There are huge pressures on families' budgets. More and more people are struggling to keep up with their housing costs. We're hearing more concern about rent arrears. I know Citizens Advice Scotland is hearing the same. And all of that pressure is ramping up the probability that rent arrears reach the stage where an eviction is triggered, and as the previous statistics show us, that can lead to homelessness. So I just want to move on now to talk about housing costs and housing conditions rather, and location. This is the other aspect of the conditions around housing as a human right in terms of how far we have to travel that I wanted to make mention of. Now, Shelter Scotland's got a lot of experience of working with families in different parts of Scotland over a number of years. And all of that experience highlights quite a wide range of housing conditions issues that families experience. And that also does include the location aspect of the housing, which is really critical. So particularly families, for example, who fled domestic abuse, if they're placed in the wrong location, that family will still feel and be unsafe. There can be a range of location issues that make families feel unsafe, but conditions issues can make families feel unsafe. There's also issues about being placed in housing, which doesn't help families keep connections in terms of families connections, friends connections, all our social networks that support them. In terms of conditions, I just wanted to give one example of how bad the conditions can be. I'm not just talking about a bit of damp here. So one of the people who came to us for help was a woman called Annabelle. She was living in a 4-bedroom property in the private rented sector. Now this property was in extremely poor conditions. The living room wall was actually subsiding. There was dampness. Now, partly that was due to internal doors being used as external doors, but that dampness was at the extent that it was leading to dangerous problems with the electrics, as well as ruining the kids' bedding. Now, one builder who went in to undertake repairs in the property was so shocked at the state of how things were. He personally went out and bought new mattresses for the kids. And he also said that the second floor where the children slept was about a week and a half away from collapsing. Now, these are some of the dreadful situations that we're seeing families in. I think we all know that the other challenge here is that families don't have the luxury of dealing with one problem at a time. They're quite often dealing with multiple problems and trying to get help with that. And the kinds of barriers that families tell us about in terms of, what's it like when they're trying to get resolution to those complexity of problems? Poor communication from a variety of services keeps emerging as a big problem. A huge issue about feeling of a lack of control, and I want to pick that up later on, and I think it relates very well to Satwat's point about empowerment and participation. Families just generally say to us they feel overwhelmed, they don't know how to navigate the system, they don't know how to get help. And before I leave housing conditions, I want to mention overcrowding. This is an increasingly common issue that we see because of how long families are stuck in temporary accommodation, and also because families change and grow over time. And that can sometimes mean that some housing options start to be out of reach financially for that family. It's also a product of the incredibly long waiting lists that we see when families are waiting to get a social home. We've now got over 132,000 households in Scotland waiting for some form of social housing. So that, unfortunately, is a pretty dreary and dreadful backdrop that we need to really face up to in terms of saying, how do we tackle all of that if we're really going to make sure that housing as a human right is realised for everyone in Scotland? So we could just move on to the next slide. This is the big one. This is the big structural solution. We need to build more social homes. If everybody's going to have the right to a home, there needs to be enough social homes for that right to be a reality for everyone across Scotland. Now, Shelter Scotland really welcomes the commitments that the Scottish Government made in Housing 2040 to really increase its supply of affordable housing and particularly social housing. And that commitment's 110,000 affordable homes, 70% for social rent by 2032. A really welcome commitment. But we need to view that against the fact that we've had decades of underinvestment in social housing. And Right to Buy, that programme led to 500,000 homes leaving the supply chain in terms of social accommodation. We have got a very big catch-up job to do. Now, the commitment that the Scottish Government has made has to be matched by the political will to drive through the barriers that will exist to delivering on those commitments. And we need to do it at pace if we're to see a real impact, particularly on child poverty. And it's not just building any old house, any old where. We have to see this be the right homes in the right places for families in order to reduce housing need and really meet these wider social justice aims. So if we could move on to the next slide. I think the other part of closing the gap between rights and reality is making sure that we, sorry, I think we've maybe skipped a slide. Can we just dash back? Oh, I think I've maybe missed a slide. Can we just go on to the next slide? Right. If we just go back to that one. So I think there's a slide missing. That could be my fault. So I'll totally hold my hand up to that one. So I'll just throw in a bit more narrative given that we're missing the slide. What I was going to talk about here was the need to consistently enforce the rights that we've already got and learn the lessons about why are those rights not being consistently enforced right now. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Scotland has some of the most progressive housing legislation in the world. And over time, people should be finding it easier to secure the safe home that's so vital to a fulfilling and safe and secure life. But we continue to see a huge gap between technical rights and what's delivered on the ground. Now, one issue is that people in far too many cases don't know what rights they have. But we've also got a situation where public bodies are struggling under the weight of cuts in services, they're struggling with increasing demand, and they're not able to enforce the rights that people currently have. Now, Shelter Scotland believes that by taking a human rights-based approach, we can increase the accountability for the fulfilment of, in practice of human rights. It's about ensuring that the rights to housing that we've already got in domestic legislation and international human rights law are achieved and enforced in practice for everyone. And this is about holding public bodies and duty bearers accountable, and also making sure there's a clear remedy for individuals when rights are denied, which I think was a point that Satma made really well also. Shelter Scotland's thus proposing that we build on the UNCRCR Incorporation Bill and also the work of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, who describe a human rights-based approach as a framework for using international human rights standards to ensure that people's human rights are put at the very centre of policies and practice. And we would argue that there's various values of the human rights-based approach, which include that focus on empowering individuals and groups to know and to claim their rights. And as Satwat was saying earlier, this is about involving people in decision-making and change, moving away from seeing people as passive recipients of services. We also welcome the emphasis on structural causes, addressing structural injustices, which are key to realising people's rights and key to preventing people from realising those rights indeed. And finally, that we really welcome the emphasis on ability and accountability of individuals and institutions who are at the end of the day responsible for respecting, protecting and fulfilling rights. We have to make sure that people can seek rights when they're seek remedies rather when their rights are violated. So if we could move on to the next slide. Yay, brilliant, all working smoothly. I'm going to finish off by just highlighting what we think is a fantastic set of very commonly used principles, which many people here today are probably familiar with. Key principles in terms of practical application of a human rights approach. Involve people in decision-making, participation, accountability, as I say, making sure that there are remedies when things go wrong. All forms of discrimination must be prevented and eliminated, and the people who face the biggest barriers to realising their rights have to be prioritised. Empowerment, again, make sure that people understand their rights and are fully supported to take part in developing policy and practice which affect them. They cannot be passive in this process. And legality, again, we must make sure that legal rights are set out in domestic and international laws in ways that help us hold the public bodies to account. The final comments that I would leave with are, how do we make sure that we learn the lessons from the failures that we've currently got to consistently enforce housing rights? That's a big issue for Shelter Scotland. Given the highly progressive nature of the housing rights that we've got, I think it's a good example to look to understand what do we have to do to close those gaps so that human rights really live and breathe and drive real change for families. 2022 marks 10 years since the passing of the totemic 2012 commitment, as we called it. Now, this was the final slotting into place of a series of legislative changes that were meant to end homelessness in Scotland. And in those 10 years, homelessness has continued to go up. For 3 consecutive years, even before the pandemic, homelessness had gone up. The right to a home can only be realised when there's enough homes to make that right a reality for everyone in Scotland. And that's a clear focus of what I'd want to leave people with. Really looking forward to now taking part in the discussion, hearing from SallyAnn and taking any questions that you've got at this part of the event. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alison. I mean, I think that is a really very clear picture of absolutely why we need to solve the housing problem for families and the absolute pain and hardship it causes. I mean, how much, if you're living in insecure or inadequate housing, how difficult is it to deal with every other part of your life? I think, you know, from what Satwat said and what Alison said, you know, a rights-based approach is absolutely crucial. It provides that framework. But so often I do think that we're kind of asking families that are living in poverty and poor housing to attain what other families do, as if they're walking on a tightrope. They have so much else to deal with. And hopefully, you know, as you say, it's about making those rights a reality, because we have a lot of rights that are not being enforced, and it is about implementation, and it is about proper resourcing, and also for the public authorities that have to enforce them, they need to be given the resources to do so. We're going to move on to SallyAnn Kelly from Aberlour, who are one of the Parenting Across Scotland partners. And SallyAnn's going to talk about family support and, well, I suppose Aberlour's approach, but a more general approach to how families need to be supported. I think we saw from the independent care review the recommendations that came from that, and particularly the very strong recommendations that came about what was needed by family support and the 10 principles. And I was going to say about the Family Wellbeing Fund, and I'm actually thinking SallyAnn's going to tell us all about all that sort of thing. So I'll pass on to SallyAnn. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I'm really happy to be here and following on from Satwat and Alison. I'm not going to talk or repeat what Alison or Satwat have spoken about and spoken about so eloquently. I do want to concentrate on family support, and suffice to say that homelessness and poverty are massive issues for a lot of the families that we support. In terms of my preamble, I think in terms of looking at the Uncrc and the principles around direct incorporation into Scots law, I think it's really important for us to understand that the Uncrc is that floor that Satwat talked about. These are not, high level, aspirations for how our children should live. They are the most basic rights that our children should have. And I think then, if we think about where we are within Scotland and the wider UK, it's a sad indictment actually on our country, just how far we have to go, because the Uncrc explicitly recognises the central role of parents, guardians and carers in the bringing up of children and ensuring children grow up safe and healthy and happy and loved. And that's a really important thing for us to remember, especially when we look at our own statistics in Scotland that tell us that within the 10% poorest communities, the children in those communities from families are 20 times more likely to come into the care of the state. And that's a very sobering reminder, I think, of how far we have to go in terms of realising children's rights to live within the context of their family. But the Uncrc goes further than that, because it talks about the role of the state in ensuring that support is there for families, especially families who are struggling with key issues in their family. The extra support should be made available. And I think this speaks to the heart of some of the tensions that we have within our society. I think that the ideological tensions that coexist on a daily basis between some of the thinking at Westminster and the thinking in Scotland in relation to the role of the state, how big that state should be, how legitimate it is for the state to intervene proactively in families' lives. All of that really has a direct impact on the experiences of children and families who are encountering additional stresses and challenges in their day-to-day lives. And so I think that direct incorporation is something that we really need to look at as a vehicle for overcoming some of the kind of vagaries of some of those political ideologies that actually, regardless of who's in power, if we have direct incorporation into Scots law and hopefully UK law, then actually it gives families a reference point. It gives people working on behalf of families a reference point that we can point to say, as a state, the contract that we have agreed with our families is one where we will not allow them to fall below these standards because it's unacceptable and actually it's unlawful. And it is something that we all need to be accountable for. And I think that's one of the strongest arguments for me of incorporation is the increased accountability that state providers and providers in the charity sector will have in terms of making sure that the rights of people are realised and looked after. Because legislation, regardless of how progressive it seems to be to date, has failed to provide that coherent framework on which families can rely. So that's something that I think is helpful for families, but it's also helpful for people who are working to support families, because if our citizens understand their rights and understand how to access those rights and realise those rights, and we have a workforce that is equally informed, then that is a really powerful combination for our families. So I think that's just something around the background of UNCRC incorporation I'd want us to think about. I'm not going to go over all of the articles that Satwat and Alison have spoken about. There's clearly numerous articles within the convention that are really relevant to family support, particularly 5, 18, 26 and 27. And I think that those, if incorporated, give us again that framework within which we can tackle and challenge some of the decision making that is happening within our state structures and our broader communities at the moment. And one of the things I think when we're looking at family support, and there's been a lot of work that's happened over family to look at family support, and Claire's talked about that, and we've got the principles of family support which are around working alongside families, being led by them in terms of what they believe is important in their lives. It's about being non-judgmental. It's about actually understanding at a really deep level what makes a difference for families. And the work that's been done is really about making sure that we have a coherent approach to supporting families who need extra help. Because at the moment, the picture in Scotland is pretty patchwork quilt-like. There is no coherence there, and we need something that's much more suitable. You know, that wherever you are in Scotland, whatever your additional needs are, whatever your challenges that you face, that you have a route to actually approach or be offered support that actually meets your need. And that support is a combination of practical, emotional and financial support that should be available to families. Because Satwat talked about poverty, and we know actually that poverty in and of itself is a huge issue for families. It's an accelerator. It increases the likelihood of people experiencing other challenges in their life in relation to mental health, in relation to poor physical health outcomes, poor social outcomes. So we see the provision of an adequate income as an integral part of what good family support looks like. And I think we can use the articles that we've mentioned through the course of the morning to ensure that family support is holistic, but it's also centred on what the needs of the family are. And interestingly, how we get there is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've spoken about listening to families, but actually services designed around families have to be led and shaped by the experiences of those families themselves. Because what we've seen repeatedly, and we have a lot of failure out there in terms of addressing families' challenges, what we see repeatedly in our sustained services within Aberlour are families who speak to us about the fact that they have been involved in state systems for many years, whether it's through specialist state systems like social work or the universal services like education and health. And what they tell us is that they have never felt listened to. They don't think that, these are families whose kids could be on the edge of coming into care, for example, or could be on the child protection register. And our workers go in, and we have been repeatedly told that it's the first time that the family have felt listened to in terms of what they think is going on in their lives and what they think might be helpful. And I think if we can adopt that, and I think to be fair, within the third sector, I think we're probably much more advanced in this space than elsewhere. But there is something about that cultural shift that needs to take place. The introduction of humility and how we actually work and talk to families as professionals, the assumption that we might know better than them about what might make a difference in their lives should be challenged. And the shape of services then that are put in place for those families and the shape of support that's put in place for those families needs to change. And just in really practical terms, when we talk to our families who are in crisis, really, a lot of the time those families are in crisis because of fairly straightforward, simple things. I mean, I was involved in a conversation yesterday with Scottish Government and a lot of senior leaders across Scotland around poverty, child poverty, and what our new national mission is. And the word complexity kept getting used in relation to how difficult it is to address poverty. And it occurs to me that if you're sitting in an organisation or a system that in itself is really complicated because we've made it complicated, then when you look outside of that system and say, oh my God, 1 in 4 children are living in poverty, we've got a massive poverty-related attainment gap, this is really complicated, it's very complex, how are we going to sort that? The first thing we need to do as human beings is talk to the human beings that experience the poverty and ask what their solutions might be to alleviating some of the pressures and tensions. And when we talk to our parents and their sustained services, the solutions they come up with are at times vastly different and much more simple than anything that we as professionals might have designed without actually involving them in the design process. And I think there is a massive lesson for us to learn about the assumptions we make about people living in poverty, why they're in poverty, and what the potential solutions to them moving out of poverty are. And that's something, again, that from a UNCRC perspective, if you put people at the centre of what we are doing, you take a rights-based approach, you properly talk to them about what makes a difference in their lives, then that actually is something that will be hugely impactful for children and their families. So in terms of looking a wee bit more about tackling poverty and supporting families, and I know Satwat's talked about this previously, and we know that putting money in the families' pockets is not a silver bullet, because a lot of these families have stressors and additional issues within their lives that we need to help them with. But again, if we can challenge the poverty that they're living with, part of what we're trying to do in some areas of Scotland is not just work with families, but work with the systems that end up actually making poverty-related issues worse. For example, working with the DWP locally, working with housing benefit, working with council tax, look at how we could potentially do things differently on behalf of families. That's something that we are looking to continue to do differently. And it's really important that as we do that, we take families with us, and we don't just go in there and decide what we think needs to be done in terms of families. So in terms of that support within the context of families living in poverty, it has to be family-led, it has to be coherent, and it has to be freely available on a consistent basis across Scotland. And I think that's a lot of the work that organisations like Aberlour, Children First, Bernardo's are involved in actually trying to promote. I want to talk a wee bit about the promise, because obviously as an organisation we're very involved in both working with children who are care experienced, but also trying to put in place early intervention strategies to try and stop children coming into care. An example that I just gave in terms of our sustained services is just that. It's about trying to stop kids coming into care, about trying to protect children from being on the child protection register and all of that. So the promise has given us a real clear direction in Scotland. I think we're very fortunate about the work that was done by the Care Review and was written up eloquently within the promise. And it's a really important, for me, initiative that I think that we need to embrace. Not that the promise is going to make the change, we are the change makers, but I think it gives us a great framework within which we work. And I think there's three parts to the promise that I would want to concentrate on. The first bit is that bit about the early intervention. The fact is, in Scotland, overwhelmingly, we take the children, or the children that we take into care are children from poor families. So if you're living in poverty in Scotland, you are disproportionately much more likely to lose your children to the state and state systems than other families. And our proposition is that actually, if we come in earlier and support families in a way that means something to families, then we can avoid a lot of those children being separated from their family. And we can honour the right of them to be brought up within the family context. And one of the things that we've been doing with the children that we have in our care at the moment is listening to them and encouraging them to tell us about what they think might have made a difference in their early lives. And the one consistent message that comes across from these kids is a very, very simple one. And that is, if my mum or my dad or my granny or whoever it was that was looking after that young person in the community had better support, had somebody that could just be alongside them and help them with some of the worries and troubles that were going on within those families, then they think they could have stayed at home for longer or for the duration of their childhood. And there is something really powerful about the voices of those children and what they say to us about the simple things that could have helped them and avoided them coming into care, and a coherent approach to family support and the right to access that within communities is fundamental to that. But there's also an issue in relation to how we then come to the relationships, if you like, with those children who are separated from their families. And the promise also rightly raises issues about the importance of relationships between brothers and sisters and between children and their parents. And I think there is a huge way to go in terms of how we actually nurture and repair relationships between children and their families. And we know that many children who are in care lose relationships with their family. Decisions are taken often without the involvement of children, whereby relationship and the number of times children can see their family is reduced because it is seen to be in their best interests. But actually using the Uncrc and the right to family life and the right to have those relationships is a really important way that we can start to challenge some of the thinking that maybe lead people to make those decisions. Because what we find inevitably, and we look after younger children and older children will find their way home, their version of home. They will look out and seek out rightly those relationships that they've lost. And it's up to us to try and support them to repair and restructure and recover from the loss and the separation that they've experienced. But again, incorporation gives us a way of actually challenging some of the orthodox thinking and actually puts children in the driving seat in terms of some of the decisions that could be taken. And I suppose the final thing that I would want to talk about in terms of keeping the promise is our ongoing commitment to those children who have been removed or will be removed and who stay in care placements in houses for the duration of their childhood and into their adulthood. And again, we've got really progressive legislation in Scotland in relation to the rights to through care and aftercare. The enactment of that piece of legislation is really poor. And let's be very, very clear about that. Our children are still not getting, our young people are still not getting the support that they are not just entitled to, but they absolutely need in terms of entering young adulthood. And so one of the campaigns that Aberlour is involved in with staff, the Scottish Through Care and Aftercare Forum, is looking at how we can realise the rights of those young people in quite a different way. And part of that is about saying, if we take children into care and we continue to care for them up to the age of 18, 25, whatever that is, we need to take our obligations to those children, young people, really seriously. And that means providing them with an unconditional support up to the point where they don't need it anymore. In the same way that I would provide to my children, and I hope people in the audience who have children feel the same obligation. You know, that includes financial support. So we're asking for an unconditional income for these kids. We're asking for an unconditional income that takes them way beyond what their entitlements would be in terms of, universal credit or bursaries for higher education, because actually we need to be ambitious for these children and young folk. We know the disproportionately poor outcomes that this group of young folk have, and that is, for me, a really important driver in terms of making sure that we do all that we can. Money is one part of it, but it also needs to be complemented with consistent, coherent support that's relationship-led for those young folk, so that they are not left adrift to go on with their life in very early adulthood. Because we know, in terms of brain development and how developmental stages progress, that they will be going through different changes right up to the age of 30 in terms of their capacity and their capabilities around looking after themselves independently. So we are obliged, as far as I can see, to actually make sure that we do all that we can for that group of young people who maybe move out of supported accommodation to become more independent. We can provide them with the tools that they need, both financial tools, but also practical, emotional help that they need. And I think that the promise speaks really well to many of the articles within the Uncrc, and I think that's something that, as a country, we should be really proud of, and we should be supporting in terms of its implementation. But there's other issues that are impacting here, and I think some of this really is about highlighting some of the contradictions and the I suppose the illustrations of just how far we have to go. Because when you look at other issues, and I'll take the National Care Service as a case in point, we had a consultation on a National Care Service which was fundamentally about adult care. And that's created a national conversation, hasn't it, about the role and the scope of any proposed new National Care Service. But when that formal consultation came out, it was interesting that it included a conversation about the inclusion of children's services in the National Care Service. There was no prior consultation or conversation with children's services or children or families about the inclusion in a National Care Service. And it seems to me that, and my position on this is we simply need to pause and undertake that formal consultation with children and their families before we make any definitive decisions about what happens with children's social care within the National Care Service. And I use this example because I think it does illustrate just how far we need to travel. That if we had Uncrc incorporation, it seems to me that within that clear approach to supporting families, which insists that their voice, their views and their experiences are taken into account, could have prevented a scenario whereby we are involved in a consultation asking about children's services with no real sense of what children, families themselves think of the proposal that's laid before them. So we need to think again about how we take things like the National Care Service forward. And for me, we need to pause any thoughts about putting children's services into that without further consultation. And when we look at the implementation of the Uncrc, and obviously there's been challenge by UK government, Alison's absolutely right. We need to make clear that we need to learn the past mistakes of failed implementation. And I think that's a really important feature. If we get to the stage where we can look at full incorporation in a Scottish context, then we need to make sure that that's effectively resourced, that we understand the consequences of what we're doing, and we need to understand the impact on not just the state structures, but all bodies who are involved in providing support to families. But I suppose one of my issues in relation to incorporation remains a cultural one, it remains a mindset one. Because it could be argued that Scotland has many pieces of legislation that are hugely progressive in their intent. But actually, the implementation of those hugely progressive pieces of legislation has been patchy at best. So full incorporation absolutely will give us the basis upon which we challenge that patchy implementation, and that's really, really important. But here's the rub. For us to provide better, more consistent and less judgmental support to families, we need a fundamental shift in our thinking and our mindset in this country. Because part of what has happened over many years actually is a state structure that has been created, constructed, and within it, either deliberately or otherwise, depending on where you look, what informs a lot of the behaviours is prejudice, and at times practices that are at times look as if they are deliberately intended to shame people and shame the poor. And I think that's something about what we need to challenge, that narrative. So I think using the UNCRC and its commitment to supporting families is a really important step. But actually, there are already duties on local authorities for families who need additional help. There are already duties on local authorities to ensure that children get the right to stay with their family when they can. But those are not enacted, in my view, in any coherent way because of the prejudice and judgmental way in which at times the state acts. Because that, for me, as somebody who supports state services and supports high levels of support to families, we also need to acknowledge that the state can do harm, whether consciously or unconsciously. And we need to challenge that harm. UNCRC, full incorporation, gives us a basis for doing so. But I would argue that we need to be brave enough to challenge that now when it's needed, that we need to be critical enough now to demand change when our standards fall below what families have the right to expect with or without UNCRC incorporation. And we need to do that both within our workplaces and where we are, but also in the wider community. So we absolutely need to continue to demand full incorporation. But for me, until we realise this, we can continue to remind policymakers that we need to address change now. And that means policymakers, it means practitioners, it means senior managers shifting their mindset, and they need to change the lens through which they look from a system lens and looking at protecting organisations to one that looks through the lens of the child who's experiencing the challenges that are being looked at. So I'm happy to finish there. I want to leave enough time for questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have. Sorry, dry throat post-COVID.
Thank you, SallyAnn. I absolutely agree about we already have so many pieces of legislation that are either not implemented properly or not resourced properly as well. And actually, incorporation is important. And I'm sitting on the Strategic Implementation Board of the UNCRC. And what that board said when the challenge from the Supreme Court was won by the UK government was, well, not that incorporation didn't matter, but whether we have incorporation or not, we are signed up to implement the UNCRC, and therefore we should be doing it anyway.
Absolutely.
So, I don't know, do the other speakers want to put on their videos and their microphones, and then if we could, you know, there's been such an interesting discussion. I just saw a tweet that Alison very helpfully summed it up, because I don't always have the words, and it was very eloquent about how some of the themes that had come out had really been about participation. They'd been about empowering families to be part of decision making, and I've added into that to be also part of service design and solutions, and that we really need a rights-based approach. And then, as SallyAnn has said, I think that some of that is about cultural and mindset. We embrace systems rather than actually embrace and necessarily what families want. Would be very happy for people to come in either on the chat or, you know, or to put, you know, raise their hands and so on. There's a comment from Ariana from SLCO. I'm sorry, I don't know what that is, but she's saying, you know, very much what's been said already, that regardless of copious rights and entitlements backed up by legislative duties policy, why is it that people still experience such injustice and breaches of rights? What can they do to assert their rights? And sorry, reading it out. While seeing the intolerable circumstances and situations that families find themselves in, I'm sure most of the people who work in support agencies fail to see them being corrected. Poor socioeconomic circumstances equal disproportionate inequality to access. So how do people think we can move this forward, and what is the particular uses of the UNCRC that might help this? Too big a question.
It's an enormous question, actually. Yeah. But I mean, I think what we've heard throughout the morning, I mean, I was so struck by so much of what Alison and SallyAnn have said. And I think that sort of cultural shift is critical here if we're wanting to make any long-term sustainable change. And I think that's why I agree with SallyAnn that the promise is so important to this, because that is about us all taking that responsibility for that shift and that change in what we do on a day-to-day basis, how we work, how we engage with and support families, and how we ensure that families know what it is that their rights actually are. Because so much of this isn't, you know, it's not going to happen if you don't actually know what rights you hold. And I know that the comment was made, actually, if people know what their rights are and try to get them realised, there can be a disappointment and a setback. And I think that's where we come in to support with challenging that when that happens and not being complacent about it, thinking actually Scotland's got a problem with an implementation gap. What are we going to do? Scotland's got a problem with the implementation gap. Here's what we can all do. And look to see how we work that out. And that actually part of that is about shifting away from crisis intervention. The housing crisis and homelessness that Alison spoke about, it's a crisis of our own making. Yeah, we have the power in a way and the responsibility to address that with the solutions, taking a rights-based approach. And it's about shifting away. I mean, what we have currently are a series of services based on failure demand. Our failure to do things creates demand for other services and the cost of those services. And that, you know, you might think, actually, how do we turn that around? But as SallyAnn said, if at the heart of this is what children, families are telling us are the solutions that are going to help them, some of these solutions are quite simple. Yeah. We've just created incredibly complex systems. Systems look to see how they sustain themselves. And so part of what we need to do is take a fresh look on a systemic level about what are barriers that we need to address, but not at the cost of not doing anything now.
And I really agree with that, Satwat. Yeah. I also agree with the comment that was made in the chat there about the role of advocacy in making sure that people are informed, but they're also truly empowered. You know, we hear all the time of families struggling to navigate the complexities and the challenges of our housing system. They need people alongside them to do that. And Shelter Scotland is just never going to be able to do all of that. So I really take your point about, you know, it's kind of collective and shared responsibility across a range of organisations and sectors. I think the other kind of key point for me, and I think housing rights are probably one of the best examples of this, and you were talking about this as well, SallyAnn, there are huge structural barriers that are stopping rights being consistently fulfilled for everybody. Now, in a housing context, we pretty much have the right to a home. There just aren't enough homes to make that a right for a reality. That is a really totemic example of if you don't sort the structural stuff out, you can have the best rights on the planet. Doesn't deliver. And I think what we really need to see is the political will to understand what are those barriers and the political will to tackle those barriers. And I think as we look towards incorporation, to feel confident that this is really going to deliver and the political will is there to deliver, I want to see the analysis of what needs to happen to make this actually drive real change. We need to see that delivery plan. We need to see that pathway detail to feel confident that this isn't just going to be another set of rights. As you say, SallyAnn, lots of examples of highly progressive rights in Scotland, frankly, delivering hee-haw.
Yeah. And I suppose if I can just say a wee thing here, I mean, part of what we need to do if we're involved in actually delivering services to the public, we need to soul search really about what our role over the past 30 years has been. And if every single one of us really took time to reflect on the things that we've done and the things we could have done differently. You know, I came from the public sector into the charity sector in 2008, having spent 18 years in social work. And I'm very honest that at times I was part of the problem. I was part of the problem of protecting my system and putting my system first rather than the children who relied on it. You know, and when I was in local authority, I worked almost wholly within the kind of context of child protection. And intellectually, I knew that if we did things differently, we could protect these children and these families in quite a different way by just offering them adequate income, adequate housing, which meant that the stressors that were coming through in terms of what was perceived as neglect actually could have been addressed. And I knew that intellectually, I knew it emotionally, but actually my system didn't allow me the space to be able to challenge it in a constructive way. And even the budget setting, when we got to the budgets on an annual basis, there was an assumption that everything that was spent last year would be spent again next year. There was never an invitation to fundamentally think about how we could reshape what we do to meet the needs of children and families differently. And that was across 3 local authorities, across 18 years, in one department in each of those local authorities. And it's not a criticism of people who are working in local authorities. It's just for me, it's a reflection on the reality of what they're faced with on a day-to-day basis. And you know, I think that we do need to soul search. We need to, Satwat talked about failure demand. We can identify where money is being spent because we've failed to support families. So why don't we stop spending that money in a way, so stop that and actually put the money where it needs to be, which is in the early intervention and prevention agenda. And some of this might get quite messy in terms of what that looks like in terms of structural things and local authorities. But, you know, as much as I support local authorities in the state, our state institutions have moved quite far away from being focused on communities and focused on people. And they've been driven by a managerialism at times that lacks compassion and lacks humanity. And that's what we need to rediscover, I think, in terms of how we provide public services.
Yeah, so very much there's...
So you're muted, Claire.
I just realised I was muted 2 years in. How long will it take? But yeah, I suppose it's very much about culture shift. It's about, and we end up with the framework, but it's really, really important about how we use it, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important that, you know, we will have public duty bearers who have to look at each of their strategies and policies through a child's rights lens. But how do we ensure, because I think, you know, well, one of the things that all of you have said today is very much about families often have the problems. They know and they own the problems. They very often know what are the things that are going to make things better. And it's not always the sort of thing that people sitting in policy circles think. So how do we bring families and children into those discussions?
I mean, I've got one practical example of that. A few years ago, Shelter Scotland did some work with South Lanarkshire Council, looking at taking the concept of personal housing planning with families going through the homelessness system and saying, how do we actually make that live and breathe? And you're absolutely right, Claire, it was the simple stuff that made the most powerful difference. So a lot of this was about taking the core principles of participation, choice and control and making those underpin the personal housing plan. And rather than families being made offers of accommodation without any consideration in the whole family sense of what would work for that family, the starting point was, you know, a real, and it was very strongly about advocacy, but it was a real proper consideration of what's going to work for this family. And doing that consideration in a co-produced way. So the personal housing plan was really about the practical things as well as the, you know, other aspects of what would make things work. And I remember the first time it really came to life, there was one particular family, and single parent family, and the mum was really clear. She was like, you give me a house on this street, you'll never see me again, local authority, because on that street, there's my mum, there's my bus for work, there's where the kids go. She had it all worked out. Now, you know, to begin with, the housing officers were going, you know, a bit of, aye, right. But they took a risk and they did it. They got that woman and her family a house on that street, and they did never, and this was somebody who'd been in and out of the homelessness system on multiple occasions. She knew what was going to make the difference for her and her family. And when she was listened to and that was acted on, that was a real lasting change for that family. And that's just one example. You know, everybody in this webinar will have countless examples of that, how powerful it is when you listen and act on what you've heard.
And I think what's really important there is that we don't make assumptions. We don't make assumptions about the agency families have or lack of it. We make assumptions about that at times. We don't make assumptions about what's going to be important to that family and what the issues are. I think that's at the heart of what you're saying, is that your starting point is what's important to the family, how they know who's important to them, where is important to them in terms of the neighbourhood and the place you've spoken about there, so that that network of support can be there for them. And I think a key part of that, and it's looked at in the Uncrc and it's addressed in a number of different frameworks, but it's not something we're particularly good at yet, is tackling the attitudes and the stigma that goes around supporting families and families in poverty. And like I said, assuming we know what the problem is and therefore going in there with a solution first, as opposed to that listening ear to be able to hear what's actually going on. And I'll give a very brief example, and this is from a previous job, not from here in Scotland, but it's when I worked in Camden. And we'd introduced for the first time sort of welfare rights and financial inclusion workers as part of the multi-agency family support teams we had in children's centres and Sure Start local programmes. And the head of family support saying that she had never appreciated how transformative the impact a debt reduction would have on a family, for example. You know, the welfare rights worker, so this was a family, single dad, young child on the child protection register, huge risk of the child being taken away because they felt that the father wasn't coping. Underpinning it all was stresses about debt and what that was going to mean to them. Welfare rights worker sorting out the debt problems, ensuring the family was getting what they were entitled to in benefits, including disability living allowance and things like that, reduced the stress. And the people were amazed at the difference it made in the capacity of that individual and the agency to then take control of their lives, support their child, and the child was taken off the child protection register. So that's why I think it's so critical to listen and to hear what's going to make the difference to the families.
And I think that's a great example, Satwat, and you and I could probably give dozens of more examples from our experience of paying debt off for families now. But, you know, when we made a decision in Aberlour to actually use our Urgent Assistance Fund to pay debt off for families, because we were getting people coming and asking for support, you know, on a repeat basis. And when we looked behind what that was, it was because they were having to pay down public debt in the main, public debt to public agencies, which left them in a perpetual state of destitution. So you have this obscene situation on one level where a charity has to step in to clear the public debt that the public agencies could take the decision to clear to actually try and get a family on an even keel. But it's been transformative for the families where we have done it. And actually what I find really annoying, enraging, you know, fascinating is how we still have people, learned people, when I talk to them about clearing families' debts off, telling me that that would be irresponsible to give poor people money because they'll spend it on all the wrong things. When all of the research tells us that's not the case, but we still have a narrative based on discrimination and prejudice, which says that poor people can't make the right decisions for their families. And that, again, is part of what we need to challenge.
I think we're probably going to finish there, but it feels a really powerful point to finish on, actually, that people can make the right decisions for their families. Parents, for the most part, want to do the best for their children, as we all do. Everybody, whether they're living in poverty or not, but if you are living in poverty, if you have the stress of debt or poor housing or inadequate income or a 0 hours contract, not knowing how much money you're going to get, of course it makes it so much worse. And we have to tackle those structural barriers, and we have to tackle the cultural mindset. There's so much we have to tackle, but having talked, you know, having had SallyAnn, Alison and Satwat with us today, given these really powerful presentations, I believe that there is a way through, and we have to work together, particularly to bring families more into the equation. I just wanted to say 2 more kind of housekeeping almost type of things. One is that we had a briefing for this, for the speakers, which we're going to produce into a less sort of technical version, a shorter version, which we will circulate to everyone who's been at the webinar and more widely. And also the fact that we are going to be running more webinars on families and the Uncrc, and we hope that you'll attend. And once again, apologies for the beginning and the technical difficulties that we've had, but I'm sure you'll agree that it was well worth waiting for. So thank you very much to our speakers, and goodbye.